Between October 7th and 9th, 1983, 12 hunters vanished across 640 acres of wheat fields in Harper County, Kansas, in what would become known as the Harper County Massacre. All adults, all eliminated with rifle fire from distances ranging from 100 to 400 yards. The perpetrator wasn't a serial killer, wasn't a madman, wasn't even someone with a criminal history. He was Russell Dean Whitaker, a 47-year-old wheat and hog farmer, working alone, methodically removing trespassers from land his family had owned for 113 years. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation would later call it the most calculated property defense killing in American history. But the motive wasn't insanity, wasn't random violence, wasn't even a personal grudge against the victims. It was trespassing. Simple trespassing on posted private property. And one man's unshakable belief that the boundaries his grandfather had surveyed in 1870 mattered more than 12 human lives. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Harper County, Kansas, sprawled across 808 square miles of rolling plains in the south-central part of the state in 1983. Population stood at 7,100, down from nearly 12,000 in 1950 when wheat prices were high and family farms still seemed like a viable future. The county seat, Anthony, held barely 2,300 souls who knew each other's debts, each other's failures, and each other's desperation going back generations. October in Kansas meant temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night, climbing to maybe 65 by mid-afternoon if the wind wasn't blowing too hard from the north. The air smelled like diesel exhaust from combines working late into harvest season, mixed with the sweet rot smell of grain dust and the particular mineral scent of topsoil exposed after plowing. At dawn, when fog settled in the low areas, you could see for miles across flat land, interrupted only by occasional shelter belts of cottonwood and elm, their leaves already yellow and falling. Sound traveled strange on the plains. Sometimes you'd hear a truck engine 5 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a combine working 2 fields over until it was right on top of you. But 1983 was a catastrophic year for American agriculture. The farm crisis that had been building since the late 70s had finally collapsed into full disaster. Interest rates had hit 21% in 1981. Land values were dropping 30 to 40%. Banks were foreclosing on family farms at rates not seen since the Great Depression. In Harper County, 63 farms went to auction in 1983 alone. Men who'd worked the same land their great-grandfathers had homesteaded were watching strangers bid on their legacy for pennies on the dollar. Suicides among farmers had increased 400% across Kansas since 1980. The government offered no help. Reagan's Agriculture Secretary John Block had famously told farmers to get big or get out. For men who measured their worth in generations of continuous occupation, who believed that keeping family land was a sacred duty, the economic collapse felt like a betrayal of everything America had promised. In places like Harper County, the social fabric was tearing apart. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Churches split over whether to help families in foreclosure or respect the bank's property rights. The cafes in Anthony, that used to fill every morning with farmers drinking coffee and talking weather sat half empty. The conversation died down to nothing. Into this economic wasteland came the hunters. Not local men hunting familiar land with permission. These were tourists from Wichita, from Kansas City, from as far away as Omaha and Oklahoma City. They came in late model trucks and Broncos wearing expensive hunting vests and carrying shotguns that cost more than most Harper County families made in a month. They came for pheasant season, which opened the first Saturday of October, and brought an estimated 50,000 out-of-state hunters to Kansas every year. The state promoted it, sold licenses, encouraged the economic injection. But the hunters treated rural Kansas like a theme park. They drove across planted fields, cut fences, left gates open, and acted like empty land was public land. They saw posted signs and ignored them, figuring some old farmer wouldn't do anything but complain. For farmers already losing everything, watching city people treat their property like a playground was salt in an open wound. Russell Dean Whitaker watched them come every October, watched them cross his land, despite the signs, despite his warnings, despite everything his family had built. And in October 1983, he decided watching was over. The Whitaker farm sat 8 miles northeast of Anthony, accessible only by county roads that turned to mud when it rained and developed washboard ruts that could shake your truck apart if you drove too fast. 640 acres, a full section, rectangular and perfect, bordered on all 4 sides by county roads and other farms. Russell Dean Whitaker was 47 years old that October, though he looked closer to 60. 6 feet tall but stooped forward from 3 decades of physical labor, his spine compressed from lifting feed sacks and wrestling hogs. His face was weathered like old boot leather, creased with lines that ran deep from the corners of his eyes and mouth. A thick scar crossed his right hand from thumb to wrist, souvenir from a combine accident in 1968 that had taken 2 fingers from his hired man and left Russell with nerve damage that made his hand shake in cold weather. His eyes were pale blue, the color washed out by decades of staring into Kansas sun and dust. When he looked at you, he didn't blink much, didn't look away first, didn't soften his gaze with social pleasantry. Every morning, Russell woke at 4:30, made coffee in a percolator so old the electrical cord was wrapped in electrical tape, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a Bible his grandmother had given him in 1948. He'd read 1 chapter from the Old Testament, preferring Deuteronomy and Joshua, books about boundaries and promised land and the obligations of inheritance. Then he'd drink his coffee black and bitter, smoke 1 unfiltered Pall Mall cigarette, and step outside to watch the sun come up over flat land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. He'd stand there for exactly 15 minutes, regardless of weather, just looking at his property. Then he'd start his day. Russell had married Martha Louise Peterson in 1958. Right after his discharge from the Army, he'd served 2 years in Germany, never saw combat, came home to Harper County because he'd never imagined living anywhere else. They'd had 2 children. Carol was 26 now, married to an accountant, living in Wichita. Daniel was 23, working construction in Kansas City. Both had left the farm as soon as they could. Neither had any interest in coming back. Martha was 45, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by wind and worry. She'd buried both her parents, watched her brother lose his farm to foreclosure in 1982, and now lived with the knowledge that their own farm was one bad year from the auction block. What Russell valued most wasn't the money farming brought, though God knew they needed every dollar with grain prices in the basement and operating loans coming due. What he valued was continuation. His great-great-grandfather, William Whitaker, had claimed this land in 1870 under the Homestead Act, 160 acres initially, expanded over generations to a full section. William's son had survived the drought of the 1880s. William's grandson had survived the Depression, barely, but Russell's father had put a shotgun in his mouth in the barn in 1953 after 3 straight years of crop failure and mounting debt. Russell had been 17, had found the body, had cleaned up the barn himself because he didn't want his mother to see. That suicide had taught Russell something fundamental about the relationship between a man and his land. You didn't own it, it owned you. You were just the current steward in a chain that stretched backward to your ancestors and forward to descendants who didn't exist yet. Your job was to keep it, to hold it, to pass it on intact. Anything that threatened that continuity was an existential threat that justified any response. The farm itself had changed dramatically over Russell's lifetime. In 1979, after wheat prices collapsed and operating costs made traditional farming unsustainable, Russell had taken out a loan to build a hog confinement operation. The barn sat 400 yards behind the main house, a metal pole building 100 feet long and 40 feet wide, designed to house 200 Yorkshire hogs in concrete pens with automated feeding and waste systems. The hogs averaged 250 to 300 pounds each, were fed a mix of corn and soybean meal 3 times daily, and reached market weight in approximately 5 months. Russell had learned everything about industrial hog farming from extension agents and trade publications. He'd learned that hogs were efficient converters of feed to meat. He'd learned that they were omnivores with digestive systems capable of breaking down almost anything organic. He'd learned that a hungry hog would eat until nothing remained, including bones, including teeth, including anything you put in front of them. This knowledge, learned for purely agricultural purposes, would later serve a different function entirely. Martha helped with the hog operation, handling the paperwork and managing the feed deliveries. Their children had helped when they were younger, before they'd escaped to cities and lives that didn't smell like manure and grain dust. Now it was just Russell and Martha and 200 pigs in a metal building that rattled when the wind blew hard. The farm produced approximately 15,000 bushels of wheat in good years, less in bad years, sold at whatever price the market offered. The hogs provided steadier income, approximately $80,000 annually after expenses, enough to make loan payments and keep the property taxes current. But Russell wasn't farming for profit anymore. He was farming for continuity, for the principle that his family's claim to this specific 640 acres mattered more than economics or efficiency or modern notions of progress. Russell's philosophy about property rights had hardened over years of watching the world change in ways he couldn't accept. To him, the boundary markers his great-great-grandfather had surveyed in 1870 were sacred. The original survey stakes, iron rods driven into the ground at exact quarter-mile intervals, were still in place. Russell had replaced the wooden fence posts around the property's perimeter twice in his lifetime. But he'd always made sure the new posts went in the exact locations the old ones had occupied. He maintained the fence line obsessively, walking the entire 4-mile perimeter every month, checking for breaks, tightening wire, replacing staples. He'd posted no trespassing signs every 100 feet around the entire property. Not the cheap cardboard signs from the hardware store, but custom metal signs he'd ordered from a company in Hutchinson. Each sign was 18 inches by 12 inches, bright yellow, with black letters 3 inches tall, posted, "No hunting, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." He'd mounted them on steel posts at eye level, facing outward, impossible to miss. Over the previous 5 years, Russell had filed 17 formal trespassing complaints with the Harper County Sheriff's Department. Hunters mostly, but also kids on dirt bikes, fishermen heading to the creek that crossed the southeast corner of his property, even a surveyor from the county who'd claimed he had the right to access the property to update road maps. Russell had documented every incident in a ledger he kept in his office. Date, time, description of the trespasser, description of the vehicle if applicable, action taken. He had photographs. He had tire track casts. He had spent over $3,000 on legal fees trying to prosecute trespassers, only to watch judges give them warnings or small fines that meant nothing. The law had failed him. The system had failed him. And Russell had decided that if official channels wouldn't defend property rights, then property owners would have to defend them personally. Opening day of pheasant season in Kansas fell on the first Saturday of October in 1983. October 1st, 1983, dawned cold and clear across Harper County. Temperature at 38 degrees by 6 in the morning, climbing to 52 by noon. Across the state, an estimated 47,000 hunters had purchased licenses, most of them from urban areas, most of them treating rural Kansas like their personal hunting preserve. The economic impact was significant. Hotels in towns like Anthony and Harper filled completely. Gas stations did triple their normal business. Restaurants served breakfast crowds that stretched out the door. For struggling rural economies, pheasant season represented a brief injection of cash that helped businesses survive another year. But for farmers like Russell Whitaker, it represented an annual invasion of their property rights. The hunters who would eventually cross onto Russell's land came from 3 separate groups, none of them connected, none of them aware of each other's plans. The first group consisted of 4 men from Wichita: Robert Mitchell, 34, an insurance adjuster; his brother-in-law, Frank Parsons, 39, who managed a car dealership; Dennis Crawford, 42, a high school teacher; and James Sullivan, 36, who worked in heating and air conditioning. They'd been hunting together for 8 years, made it an annual tradition, took Friday off work to drive down to Harper County on Thursday night, stayed at the Countryside Motel in Anthony, woke early Saturday morning with thermoses of coffee and boxes of shotgun shells. The second group came from Kansas City. 6 men, all in their late 20s and early 30s, all friends from college, who'd stayed in touch. They rented a farmhouse 10 miles west of Anthony for the weekend, brought coolers of beer, playing cards for the evenings, expensive Browning and Remington shotguns their wives had complained about. They saw the hunting trip as escape from office jobs and suburban responsibilities, a chance to pretend they were outdoorsmen, to post photos that made them look rugged and capable. The third group was just 2 men, local to Kansas but not to Harper County. Stephen Garrett, 48, from Dodge City, and his son Matthew, 22, making their first hunting trip together since Matthew had graduated from Kansas State. Stephen had grown up hunting, had wanted to pass the tradition to his son, had planned this trip for months as a bonding experience. None of these 12 men knew Russell Whitaker. None had any personal connection to Harper County beyond chasing pheasants across its fields, and none of them took posted signs seriously enough to matter. On Thursday, October 6th, 2 days before opening day, Russell had driven his property line one final time. He'd checked every sign, tightened every post, walked sections of fence line to ensure there were no gaps. His preparation was methodical, almost ritualistic. He wasn't hoping to prevent trespassing anymore. He was documenting that he'd done everything the law required to establish boundaries and warn intruders. But October 2nd, 4 days before opening day, Russell had encountered trespassers doing pre-season scouting. 3 men in a new Ford truck, Kansas City plates, walking his northwest section, looking for bird populations. Russell had driven his truck across the field, parked 50 yards from where they stood, and walked toward them with his hands visible and empty. The confrontation was civil at first. "This is posted private property," Russell said, his voice flat and calm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The oldest of the 3 men, wearing an expensive hunting vest with multiple pockets, smiled. "We're just looking around. Not hunting yet. Season doesn't open until Saturday." "Doesn't matter. This is private land. Those signs aren't suggestions." One of the younger men laughed. "Come on, old-timer. There's nobody even farming this land. What's the harm in us walking around?" Russell felt something tighten in his chest. Old-timer, the casual dismissal, the assumption that his property rights were negotiable. "The harm is you're trespassing. I'm giving you one warning. Leave now. Don't come back. If I see you on my land again, there will be consequences." The men exchanged glances. The older one shrugged. All right, we're going." No need to get upset. They walked back to their truck, taking their time, making it clear they weren't intimidated. As they drove away, Russell heard one of them say something that made the others laugh. He stood there for a long time after they'd gone, staring at the dust their truck had kicked up, knowing they'd be back on Saturday, knowing his warning had meant nothing to them. That evening, Russell sat at his kitchen table with Martha. She was doing bookkeeping, trying to make their farm finances work out to something survivable. Russell was cleaning his rifle, the Winchester Model 70 his father had owned, the same rifle his father had used to end his own life 30 years earlier. "You're scaring me, Russell," Martha said quietly, not looking up from the ledger. "What you're planning?" "I'm not planning anything," Russell said. "I'm just making sure I'm prepared to defend our property." "Defend it how? By shooting people?" Now she looked at him, her eyes tired and frightened. "They're just hunters, Russell. Stupid city people who don't know better. You call the sheriff, you don't. The sheriff won't do anything, you know that. I've called 17 times in 5 years. They come out, they talk to people, they write warnings that don't mean anything. The law doesn't protect property rights anymore, Martha. It protects people who take what isn't theirs and call it harmless." Martha closed the ledger. Her hands were shaking. "If you do something, if you hurt someone, they'll take the farm anyway. They'll put you in prison. I'll lose you and the land both. Russell set down the rifle, reached across the table, and took her hand. If I do nothing, we lose the land to foreclosure in 2 years, maybe 3 if we're lucky. And we lose it knowing that strangers walked all over it, disrespected it, treated it like it was theirs to use. I can't live with that, Martha. I can't be the Whitaker who let it all go without a fight. On Friday, October 7th, Russell made final preparations. He drove to a sporting goods store in Hutchinson, 30 miles north, and purchased 3 boxes of .30-06 ammunition. 60 rounds total. The clerk, a young man who looked barely old enough to work, made small talk about hunting season. Russell paid cash, didn't engage in conversation, drove home. He spent Friday afternoon checking shooting positions on his property. The northwest corner, where he'd encountered the Kansas City men, offered clear sight lines for 300 yards. The northeast section had a small rise that provided elevation advantage. The south fence line ran along a tree belt that offered concealment. Russell noted distances, wind direction, angles of approach. That evening, Carol and her husband, Tom, drove out from Wichita for dinner. Carol was 3 months pregnant, showing just enough that it was obvious. She was excited, talking about baby names and nursery colors, asking if they thought it would be a boy or girl. Russell watched her, memorized her face, the way she smiled when she talked about the future. Martha had made pot roast, Russell's favorite, with potatoes and carrots that had cooked until they were soft enough to cut with a fork. The kitchen smelled like home, like every Sunday dinner Russell remembered from childhood. Carol's husband Tom was a good man, steady and kind, the kind of son-in-law Russell had hoped for, even if the marriage meant Carol would never come back to the farm. "So, Dad," Tom said, cutting his roast into precise pieces, "how's harvest looking this year?" "Wheat yield was down about 20%, Russell said. "Prices are down 30, but we'll make it work." "And the hogs?" "Steady. They eat, they grow. We sell them. It's the only reliable income we have anymore." Carol reached across and squeezed Russell's hand. "I know things are hard right now, for everyone. But you and Mom have always figured it out. You're the toughest people I know." Russell looked at his daughter, at the way her other hand rested on her barely visible belly, protective already. "Carol, I want you to know something. This baby, your baby, this is the 6th generation of Whitakers. 6th generation with a connection to this land, to this specific place. That matters. That means something." "I know, Dad, and who knows? Maybe someday, if it's a boy, maybe he'll want a farm. Maybe he'll come back here and—" "No," Russell said, more sharply than he intended. "No, you keep him in Wichita. You give him a different life, better opportunities. This farm, this life, it's dying. Has been for years. You made the right choice leaving." Martha stood abruptly, started clearing plates even though people were still eating. Carol looked confused, hurt. Tom changed the subject to something about the Royals season. Later, after Carol and Tom had driven back to Wichita, after Martha had gone to bed without speaking to him, Russell sat on the front porch, smoking a cigarette. The temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. The sky was clear, stars bright without city light pollution. He could see the fence line of his property in the moonlight, could see the metal signs reflecting silver. Tomorrow was opening day. Tomorrow the hunters would come. and tomorrow Russell would find out if he had the courage to defend what was his, or if he'd been lying to himself all along. October 8th, 1983, Saturday. Opening day of pheasant season. Russell woke at 4 o'clock in the morning, earlier than usual. He made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter. He didn't read from the Bible, didn't smoke his usual cigarette, just dressed in layers, brown canvas work jacket over flannel shirt, jeans, boots. He loaded the Winchester, checked the scope, put extra ammunition in his jacket pockets. Martha appeared in the kitchen doorway at 4:30. She'd been crying. Her face was puffy, eyes red. "Russell, please, please don't do this." "Go back to bed, Martha." "I won't. I can't. If you're going to destroy our lives, I'm going to watch you do it." Russell looked at her for a long time. 32 years of marriage. 32 years of struggle and survival and making do with less than they needed. She'd never asked him for much, had never complained, even when she had right to. "I love you," he said. "Whatever happens today, I need you to know that. If you loved me, you wouldn't do this." Russell didn't answer. He walked out the door, got in his truck, drove to the northwest corner of his property. He parked behind a small equipment shed, 200 yards from the fence line, hidden from the road. Then he walked to a position he'd selected the day before, a slight depression in the ground that provided both concealment and clear sight lines. The sun rose at 6:47. By 7:15, light was good enough to see clearly for 400 yards. Russell lay prone. The Winchester rested on a low mound of dirt. Scope adjusted for 200 yards. He waited. The morning was cold, 36 degrees, no wind. Perfect conditions. The kind of morning hunters loved. At 7:32, Russell heard truck engines on the county road. He watched through the scope as a Ford pickup, Kansas City plates, parked on the shoulder. 4 men got out wearing bright orange vests, carrying shotguns. They stood by the truck for a few minutes, talking, loading their weapons, drinking coffee from a thermos. Then they looked at the fence line, looked at each other, and one of them pointed toward Russell's property. Russell watched through the scope as the 4 men studied his fence line. They were maybe 200 yards from his position, close enough that he could see their faces clearly in the morning light. The one who'd laughed and called him old-timer 4 days earlier was there, gesturing toward the property, saying something that made the others nod. They didn't hesitate long. One of them pushed down the top wire of the fence with his boot, creating a gap wide enough to step through. Then, one by one, all 4 crossed onto Russell's land. Russell's breathing slowed. His heart rate, which had been elevated with adrenaline, settled into something steadier. He'd hunted deer since he was 12 years old, had learned to control his body's responses, to wait for the perfect shot. This was no different. Just targets at distance, just trespassers who'd been warned and had chosen to ignore the warning. The men spread out as they walked into the field, moving in a loose line, their shotguns held ready. They were hunting pheasants, scanning the ground for movement, talking to each other in voices Russell couldn't quite hear. They were maybe 150 yards into his property when Russell made his decision. He centered the crosshairs on the chest of the man farthest to the left, the one who'd called him old-timer, exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder. The sound cracked across the morning quiet, echoing off the flat land. Through the scope, Russell saw the man drop instantly, his orange vest bright against the brown stubble of the wheat field. The other three men froze. For maybe 2 seconds, they didn't understand what had happened. One of them called out his friend's name. Then another shot and a second man fell. Now the remaining 2 understood. They ran, breaking toward the fence line they'd crossed, their shotguns forgotten, pure panic driving them. Russell tracked the third man, led him slightly to account for movement, fired. The man stumbled, went down. The fourth man made it almost to the fence before Russell's next shot dropped him 10 feet from the wire he'd pushed down to trespass. Russell stayed in position for several minutes, watching through the scope for any movement. There was none. 4 men in orange vests lay motionless in his wheat stubble, scattered across maybe 80 yards. The entire incident had taken less than 30 seconds from first shot to last. Russell stood, ejected the spent brass, pocketed the casings. He walked back to his truck, drove home, parked behind the barn. Martha was standing on the back porch, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warming morning. She looked at him, her face pale, and he knew she'd heard the shots. "How many?" she asked. "4." She turned and went inside without another word. Russell heard the bathroom door close, heard her being sick. He stood in the yard for a while, looking at the hog barn, thinking about logistics. Then he went inside, made fresh coffee, and waited. By 9:30 that morning, the second group arrived. 6 men from Kansas City in 2 vehicles, a Bronco and a Chevy Blazer. Russell watched from a different position the northeast rise he'd scouted the day before. These men parked farther down the county road, entered his property from a different angle. They were louder than the first group, laughing, joking, passing a flask between them, even though it wasn't yet 10 in the morning. Russell felt nothing as he sighted on them. No anger, no satisfaction, no remorse. Just the mechanical process of target acquisition and trigger pull. 6 shots, 6 men down, scattered across the northeast quarter of his property. The entire incident took maybe 45 seconds. By noon, Russell had accounted for 10 men, the Wichita group of 4, the Kansas City group of 6. He'd moved their bodies using his stock trailer, the same one he used to haul hogs to market. Loaded them one at a time, drove them to the barn, unloaded them into a holding pen separate from where he kept the hogs. The work was physically demanding. Dead weight was difficult to move, especially for a man his age with a bad back. But Russell had spent his entire life doing difficult physical labor. This was just one more task that needed completing. Martha stayed in the house. She'd locked herself in their bedroom. Russell could hear her crying, could hear her praying, could hear her talking to someone on the phone. Though he didn't know who. He didn't interrupt her. Some things a person had to process alone. The 2 men from Dodge City, Stephen Garrett and his son Matthew, arrived around 1 in the afternoon. Russell almost let them go. The father and son were different from the others. They walked his fence line, first looking for a gate, looking for permission. They were respectful, hesitant. The boy, 22 but still a boy in Russell's eyes, kept suggesting they try a different property, somewhere with actual permission. But the father insisted. He'd driven 3 hours, he said. They had licenses, he said. It was public land, he said, because that's what someone had told him at the gas station. And there it was, that casual assumption that empty land was available land, that posted signs were suggestions, that a farmer's boundaries didn't mean anything real. Russell shot the father first, watched the son freeze, confused, unable to process what was happening. The boy turned, started to run, and Russell shot him in the back. They fell 20 feet apart, father and son. Their hunting trip ended in the Kansas dirt they'd thought was theirs to walk on. 12 men total now. Russell sat in his truck for a long time after the last two, just sitting, staring at nothing. The sun was warm through the windshield. The temperature had climbed to 63 degrees. A beautiful October day. Perfect hunting weather. He loaded the last two bodies into the trailer, drove them to the barn. By 2:30 in the afternoon, all 12 trespassers were accounted for, their bodies arranged in the holding pen, their vehicles still parked along various county roads around his property. The hogs hadn't been fed that morning. Russell had skipped their usual 6 a.m. feeding deliberately. 200 Yorkshire pigs, each weighing between 250 and 300 pounds, were hungry. Their normal feeding schedule was strict, their bodies conditioned to expect food at specific times. When food didn't come, they became agitated. Russell had learned from extension publications that hogs were opportunistic omnivores. In the wild, they'd eat anything, plant or animal matter, living or dead. Domestic hogs retained this capability. A hungry hog would consume bone, would consume everything, would leave nothing that could be identified. He opened the gate between the holding pen and the main hog confinement. The pigs surged forward, 200 animals moving as a mass toward the unexpected food source. Russell left the barn, closed the main door, walked back to the house. He didn't watch, didn't need to. Nature would take its course. Biology would solve the disposal problem that had been his main concern in planning this. Martha was still locked in the bedroom. Russell sat at the kitchen table, drank coffee, and waited. The work wasn't done yet. He still had to deal with the vehicles, with the physical evidence scattered across his property. Shell casings, tire tracks, the signs that 12 men had crossed his fence line and never crossed back. Sunday, October 9th, 1983, the day after opening day of pheasant season. In Wichita, Robert Mitchell's wife, Patricia, started making phone calls around 10 in the morning. Her husband and his hunting group were supposed to have been home by 8. They weren't answering at the motel. The motel clerk said they'd never checked out. Their rooms were still full of gear, but the men in their truck were gone. In Kansas City, the wives and girlfriends of the 6-man hunting party were comparing notes by 11. None of their men had called. None had come home. The farmhouse they'd rented was locked. The vehicles gone. Initial concern was shifting toward genuine worry. In Dodge City, Stephen Garrett's wife, Ellen, called the Harper County Sheriff's Department at noon. Her husband and son had planned to hunt Saturday, stay overnight somewhere, be home Sunday morning by 10 at the latest. It was noon. They weren't home. They weren't answering their CB radio. Something was wrong. By 2 in the afternoon, 3 separate missing persons reports had been filed with Harper County Sheriff's Department. 3 different groups, 12 total men, all last known to be hunting in Harper County, all vanished within the same 24-hour period. Dispatcher Mary Ellen Hodges took the calls, noted the information, felt her stomach tighten with each new report. 12 missing hunters wasn't normal. Wasn't explainable by getting lost or having truck trouble. Sheriff Dale Perkins was 58 years old, had held the position for 16 years, had dealt with hunting accidents, heart attacks in the field, even one case of a hunter shooting another hunter by mistake. But he'd never had 12 men disappear simultaneously. He called in his 3 deputies, contacted the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and started organizing search parties. By Sunday evening, volunteer searchers were combing the areas where the missing men's vehicles had been found. 4 vehicles total, parked along county roads in different locations, all within a 15-mile radius. The vehicles were unlocked, hunting gear still inside, no signs of struggle or foul play. The men had simply walked away from their vehicles and vanished. Monday morning, the searches intensified. Kansas Bureau of Investigation sent 4 agents. The Civil Air Patrol put up aircraft to search from above. Local farmers allowed access to their property. Volunteers walked fence lines, checked old wells, looked for any sign of 12 missing men. Russell Whitaker cooperated fully. When deputies knocked on his door Monday morning asking permission to search his property, he invited them in, offered coffee, showed them his land. 2 deputies walked his fence lines, checked his outbuildings, looked at the hog barn. They noticed nothing unusual, just a working farm, a quiet man, business as usual. The hogs had been fed their normal ration Monday morning. They showed no particular interest in the deputies walking near their pens. The holding area where 12 bodies had been the day before was empty, hosed clean, smelling of disinfectant. Russell had spent Sunday evening cleaning, had burned 12 sets of clothing. In his burn barrel, had scattered the ashes across his fields. The shell casings from his Winchester were in his pocket, would be disposed of separately. The blood in his wheat stubble was minimal, would be impossible to distinguish from animal blood or rust-colored soil. The tire tracks from his stock trailer matched tire tracks all over his farm, meaningless in isolation. By Tuesday, the missing persons case had attracted media attention. Television news crews from Wichita came to Harper County, interviewed Sheriff Perkins, filmed the searching volunteers, created human interest stories about 12 men who'd vanished without a trace. Families held press conferences, begged for information, offered rewards. Russell watched the news coverage Tuesday evening, saw the wives crying, saw the children asking where their fathers were, felt nothing. These men had trespassed on his land, had been warned, had made their choice. The consequences were on them. Deputy Tom Mercer was 29 years old, had been with Harper County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and had grown up on a farm himself. He understood rural life, understood farmers, understood the rhythms and patterns of agricultural work, which is why he noticed something wrong when he drove past the Whitaker property Wednesday morning, October 12th. Russell Whitaker's stock trailer was parked behind the barn in a position Tom had never seen it before. The trailer was normally kept in the equipment shed. Having it sitting out, exposed to weather, was unusual for a man as methodical as Russell. Tom slowed his patrol car, studied the property. Everything else looked normal. The house, the barn, the hog pens. But something felt off. Tom pulled into the driveway. Russell was working on his tractor in the equipment shed, looked up as Tom approached. "Deputy," Russell said, his voice neutral. "Something I can help you with?" "Just following up on the missing hunters. Wanted to ask if you'd seen or heard anything unusual Saturday or Sunday." "Asked me that Monday," Russell said. "Answer's still no." Tom nodded, looked around the property. "Mind if I ask what you're doing with the stock trailer? Seems like an odd place to park it." Russell's expression didn't change. "Used it Sunday to move some equipment. Haven't gotten around to putting it back yet." "Equipment from where to where?" "Just around the property. Farm work." Tom walked toward the trailer. It was clean, recently hosed out, but there were dark stains in the corners that looked like they might be blood. Could be hog blood. Could be from hauling butchered animals. Could be normal farm business. But combined with everything else, it raised questions. "Russell, you mind if I look in your barn?" For the first time, Russell hesitated. Just for a second, but Tom caught it. "You got a warrant?" "Don't need a warrant if you give permission. You refusing permission?" Russell calculated. Refusing would create suspicion. Allowing access would let them see the hog operation, which should be clean by now. The pigs had been given 4 days to do their work. There should be nothing left to find. "Go ahead," Russell said. "Nothing in there but hogs." Tom walked to the barn, Russell following. Inside, 200 Yorkshire pigs milled around in their pens. The smell was overwhelming, typical for a hog confinement operation. Manure, feed, animal musk. Tom walked the center aisle, looking at the pens. Everything appeared normal. Well-maintained facility, healthy-looking animals, clean water systems. Then Tom noticed something in the far corner of one pen. Something white against the dark concrete. He climbed over the pen rail, approached. The hogs moved away from him, grunting. Tom bent down, picked up the object. It was a human finger. Partially consumed, but unmistakable. Wedding ring still attached. Tom looked up at Russell, who stood at the pen rail watching him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. "Russell," Tom said quietly, "I need you to step outside the barn and put your hands behind your back." Russell didn't resist. He walked out of the barn ahead of Deputy Mercer, stepped into the October sunlight, and put his hands behind his back, without being asked twice. Tom's hands were shaking as he pulled the handcuffs from his belt. This was the biggest arrest of his career, probably the biggest arrest in Harper County history, and he was making it alone with no backup, no witnesses, nothing but a human finger with a wedding ring still attached. "Russell Dean Whitaker," Tom said, his voice steadier than he felt, "you're under arrest for suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights?" "I understand," Russell said. His voice was calm, almost resigned, like he'd been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, had made his peace with it. Tom radioed for backup. Sheriff Perkins arrived within 20 minutes, followed by 2 more deputies and 3 Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents who'd been coordinating the search efforts from the sheriff's office. They secured the property, established a perimeter, called in the state crime lab. By noon, the Whitaker farm had become the center of what would be the largest criminal investigation in Kansas history. Martha Whitaker was found in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the clothes she'd been wearing since Saturday. She was in shock, barely responsive. A female deputy stayed with her while paramedics checked her vital signs. She wasn't under arrest, wasn't a suspect, but she clearly knew something about what had happened. She'd have to be interviewed, would have to testify, would have to explain how much she knew and when she knew it. Russell was transported to the Harper County Jail in Anthony. He sat in the back of Sheriff Perkins' cruiser, handcuffed, silent, watching the familiar landscape pass by the window. The wheat fields he'd known his entire life, the county roads he'd driven 10,000 times, the sky that stretched forever over flat Kansas land. He'd never see any of it again as a free man. The hog barn was sealed as a crime scene. Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents spent the next 3 days processing it, documenting it, photographing every inch. They found more human remains in the hog pens. Small bone fragments, teeth, another finger, a wedding ring, a portion of a jawbone with dental work still visible. Enough to confirm that multiple bodies had been fed to the hogs. Enough to make seasoned investigators vomit outside the barn. The hogs themselves became evidence. All 200 Yorkshire pigs were euthanized over the next week, their stomach contents examined, their digestive tracts analyzed. The forensic work was gruesome, unprecedented, necessary. Investigators found human DNA in multiple animals, found bone fragments, tooth enamel, metal from belt buckles and zippers. The biological reality of what Russell had done was worse than anyone had imagined. Across the property, investigators found shell casings. 12 spent .30-06 cartridges, carefully collected from 3 different shooting positions. They found blood in the wheat stubble, small amounts but enough to type. They found tire tracks from Russell's stock trailer. They found cleaning supplies, bleach, disinfectant. They found everything they needed to build a case that would shock a nation already becoming numb to violence. The missing hunters' vehicles were still parked along county roads. Inside them, investigators found personal effects, wallets with identification, photographs of families these men would never see again. In Robert Mitchell's truck, they found a teddy bear he'd bought for his daughter's birthday. In Stephen Garrett's vehicle, they found a camera with film still inside, the last roll Stephen and his son Matthew would ever take together. Media descended on Harper County like locusts. National news networks, newspaper reporters, television crews from as far away as New York and Los Angeles. The story had everything America couldn't look away from. A quiet farmer, property rights extremism, mass murder, hogs eating human remains, the farm crisis, rural rage. It was horrifying and compelling and impossible to ignore. Russell's first court appearance was October 14th, 2 days after his arrest. He stood before Judge William Preston in the Harper County Courthouse, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled. The courtroom was packed with media, with families of the victims, with people from Harper County who'd known Russell his entire life and couldn't reconcile the quiet farmer with the mass murderer. Judge Preston read the charges: 12 counts of first-degree murder, 12 counts of abuse of a corpse, multiple weapons charges. Russell stood silent, showed no emotion, entered a plea of not guilty on advice of his court-appointed attorney. Bail was denied. Russell was remanded to state custody pending trial. As he was led out of the courtroom, one of the victims' wives screamed at him, called him a monster, called him evil, asked him how he could sleep at night, knowing what he'd done. Russell stopped, turned, looked at her directly. "They were trespassing," he said quietly. "I warned them." Then he let the deputies lead him away. The trial of Russell Dean Whitaker began on March 5, 1984, in the Harper County Courthouse in Anthony, Kansas. The prosecution was led by Kansas Attorney General Robert Stephan himself, assisted by 2 special prosecutors from the state capitol. The case was too big, too important, too nationally scrutinized to be left to local authorities. The defense was led by Leonard Mitchell, a court-appointed public defender from Wichita, with 23 years of experience in criminal law, but nothing in his career that had prepared him for this. Jury selection took 3 weeks. The challenge was finding 12 people in Kansas who hadn't already formed an opinion about Russell Whitaker. The media coverage had been relentless. Every newspaper, every television station, every radio program had covered the story. The Hog Farmer Killer, the Harper County Massacre, the property rights murders. The headlines wrote themselves, and America couldn't get enough. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 27 to 68. 3 were farmers or former farmers. 2 had hunting experience. All claimed they could set aside what they'd heard and judge the case solely on evidence presented in court. Whether that was true would become clear over the next 6 weeks. The prosecution's case was straightforward and overwhelming. They presented forensic evidence from the crime scene. Ballistics reports proving that Russell's Winchester had fired the bullets that killed at least 8 of the 12 victims. DNA evidence from the hog barn. Testimony from Deputy Tom Mercer about the discovery of human remains. Photographs that made jurors cry, made some physically ill, made everyone in the courtroom confront the reality of what had happened. They presented testimony from the victims' families, wives describing the last conversations they'd had with their husbands, children talking about fathers who'd left for a hunting trip and never came home. Patricia Mitchell broke down on the witness stand, describing how she'd explained to her 8-year-old daughter that Daddy wasn't coming back, that Daddy had been killed, that the teddy bear he'd bought for her birthday would be the last present he'd ever give her. Stephen Garrett's wife, Ellen, testified about her husband and son, about the father-son bonding trip that had ended with both of them shot and fed to pigs. She described identifying Matthew's remains from dental records, described the funeral with 2 closed caskets, described living with the knowledge that her family had been destroyed by a man who valued property boundaries more than human life. The prosecution called expert witnesses, forensic pathologists, ballistics experts, agricultural specialists who explained the biology of hog consumption, how long it would take 200 pigs to completely consume 12 human bodies. The testimony was clinical, detailed, horrifying. By the end of the prosecution's case, there was no doubt that Russell Whitaker had killed 12 men and fed their bodies to his hogs. The defense strategy was more complex. Leonard Mitchell couldn't dispute the facts. The evidence was overwhelming. Russell had killed 12 men. The question was why, and whether that why mattered in the eyes of the law. Mitchell presented Russell's history, 4 generations of continuous family ownership of the same 640 acres. The economic pressures of the farm crisis, the bank loans coming due, the foreclosure threats, the repeated trespassing violations that law enforcement had failed to address. The 17 formal complaints Russell had filed over 5 years. The thousands of dollars spent on legal fees trying to protect his property through official channels. He called witnesses who testified about Russell's character. Neighbors who'd known him for decades, who described him as quiet, law-abiding, someone who kept to himself, but was always willing to help when help was needed. His pastor from First Baptist Church in Anthony, who testified that Russell had been a faithful member for 37 years, had taught Sunday school, had never shown signs of violence or instability. Mitchell presented psychiatric testimony. Dr. Raymond Foster, a forensic psychiatrist from Kansas City, testified that Russell had suffered a complete mental breakdown triggered by the cumulative stress of the farm crisis, the repeated property violations, and the systemic failure of law enforcement to protect his rights. He diagnosed Russell with severe depression, post-traumatic stress disorder related to finding his father's body after suicide, and a delusional belief system centered on property rights. The prosecution destroyed this defense on cross-examination. They showed that Russell's planning had been methodical, not impulsive, that he'd purchased ammunition days in advance, that he'd selected shooting positions, that he'd prepared the hog barn for disposal, that he'd cleaned up evidence afterward, that he'd lied to investigators. All evidence of premeditation, of clear thinking, of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and understood it was wrong. Russell himself testified in his own defense, against his attorney's advice. He took the stand on April 18, 1984, and spent 4 hours explaining his actions in a calm, measured voice that chilled everyone who heard it. Russell's testimony was unlike anything the courtroom had heard. He didn't deny killing 12 men, didn't claim insanity or temporary breakdown or diminished capacity. He simply explained, in precise detail, why he believed he'd had no choice. "My great-great-grandfather claimed that land in 1870, Russell said, his voice steady, his hands folded on the witness stand. He walked every foot of those 640 acres, drove stakes at every corner, filed the proper paperwork with the federal government. He survived drought, survived grasshoppers, survived everything Kansas could throw at him. He passed it to his son, who passed it to his son, who passed it to my father. 4 generations of Whitakers, every one of them believing that if they worked hard enough, if they were good stewards, they could pass something of value to the next generation. He described his father's suicide, the 3 years of crop failure, the mounting debt, finding the body in the barn, cleaning up so his mother wouldn't have to see. My father believed that failing to keep the land was failing his ancestors and his descendants. That belief killed him. But it also taught me that this land wasn't just property. It was identity. It was meaning. It was the only thing that proved our family had existed, had mattered, had built something that lasted. He described the trespassing problem, the hunters who came every year, who ignored posted signs, who treated his land like public property. I tried the legal way, filed 17 complaints over 5 years, spent $3,000 on legal fees. Know what happened? Warnings, small fines, nothing that stopped them from coming back. The law said this was my property, said trespassing was illegal, but the law wouldn't protect those rights. So what good was the law? The prosecutor, Robert Steffen, challenged him on cross-examination. Mr. Whitaker, you killed 12 men, 12 human beings with families, with children, with lives. How do you justify that? I don't justify it, Russell said. I'm explaining it. Those men made a choice. They saw posted signs every 100 feet. They knew it was private property. They chose to trespass anyway because they didn't believe my property rights mattered. They were wrong. So, in your mind, trespassing justifies execution? In my mind, a man has the right to defend what's his. If the law won't do it, he has to do it himself. You shot a 22-year-old boy in the back while he was running away. Matthew Garrett. How was that defending your property? For the first time, Russell's composure cracked slightly. He was trespassing. His father brought him there, told him it was okay to cross my fence. The father's mistake doesn't change what they were doing. The prosecution played audio recordings of the victims' families, the sounds of children crying for their fathers. The testimony was devastating, turned the jury against Russell in ways the evidence alone hadn't managed. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes. They returned verdicts of guilty on all 12 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on all 12 counts of abuse of a corpse, guilty on weapons charges. The courtroom erupted. Victims' families cried, hugged each other, shouted that justice had been served. Russell stood impassive, showing nothing. Kansas law allowed for the death penalty in cases of multiple murders. The prosecution asked for it, argued that Russell's crimes were premeditated, heinous, showed a complete disregard for human life, that he'd killed 12 men, including a father and son, and shown no remorse, that he deserved the ultimate penalty. The defense argued for life imprisonment, presented Russell's age, his lack of criminal history, his mental state, the extraordinary pressures of the farm crisis. Mitchell gave an impassioned closing argument about a broken man in a broken system who'd committed terrible acts but didn't deserve to die for them. Judge William Preston took 2 weeks to consider. On April 27, 1984, he delivered his sentence in a courtroom packed beyond capacity. He sentenced Russell to 12 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Not the death penalty, but effectively a death sentence for a 47-year-old man. Preston explained his reasoning. The state of Kansas has the right to execute you, Mr. Whitaker. You've committed crimes that shock the conscience, that violate every principle of civilized society. But executing you would make you a martyr to those who share your extremist views about property rights. It would turn you into a symbol. Better that you spend the rest of your life in prison forgotten, your land sold to pay restitution to the families you destroyed. Russell was led from the courtroom. Martha Whitaker, who'd sat through every day of the trial, filed for divorce 1 week later. The 640 acres that 4 generations of Whitakers had owned were sold at auction in 1985. Russell Dean Whitaker spent 35 years in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, Kansas. He was a model prisoner, never caused trouble, never filed grievances, never applied for clemency or parole, despite having no possibility of either. He worked in the prison library, helped other inmates with legal documents, spent his evenings reading books about agriculture and Kansas history. He died on November 3rd, 2019, at the age of 83. Cause of death was pneumonia complicated by congestive heart failure. He was buried in the prison cemetery, grave marked with a simple numbered marker. No family attended. Martha had died in 2011, never having spoken to Russell after the divorce. Carol had changed her name, moved to Colorado, refused all contact. Daniel hadn't spoken to his father since the arrest. The Whitaker farm was purchased at auction in 1985 by an agricultural corporation based in Oklahoma. They paid $130,000, roughly 20% of what the land would have been worth before the murders. The stigma of being the Hog Farmer Killer's property depressed the value, made it hard to find buyers. The new owners demolished the hog barn in 1990. They couldn't find anyone willing to work in a building where 12 people had been fed to pigs. The concrete foundation was broken up, removed, the ground underneath excavated to a depth of 3 feet, and replaced with clean fill. Nothing visible remains of where the barn stood. The house Russell and Martha had lived in, the house his grandfather had built in 1923, was torn down in 1995. The corporation built a modern metal warehouse on the site, used the property for equipment storage. In 2006, they sold the land to a farming operation from Texas. Today, the property is part of a 12,000-acre corporate farm operation. The original survey stakes William Whitaker placed in 1870 are gone. The fence lines Russell obsessively maintained have been removed. The posted signs warning trespassers are long gone. The land produces corn and soybeans under center pivot irrigation systems. Nobody who works there knows the history. Nobody who drives past on the county road realizes that this was where 12 men died, defending their right to hunt, and 1 man destroyed his legacy trying to protect it. There is no memorial, no historical marker, no plaque explaining what happened on this land in October 1983. Harper County has tried to forget. The story comes up occasionally when someone researches Kansas crime history, when a documentary filmmaker gets interested, when true crime podcasts need content. But mostly it's forgotten. Sheriff Dale Perkins retired in 1991. He died in 2004 at the age of 79. In an interview 2 years before his death, he said, "The Whitaker case taught me that property rights extremism is just another form of terrorism. Russell Whitaker believed his land was more important than human life. That belief made him into a monster. But he wasn't born a monster. The system failed him, failed the victims, failed everyone. When law enforcement can't protect property rights and can't prevent vigilante justice, the result is what happened in Harper County. Captain Frank Morrison of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, who led the forensic investigation, retired in 1998. He gave a lecture at the FBI Academy in Quantico in 2003 about the case. What haunted me, he told the class of new agents, was that Russell Whitaker wasn't insane. He was rational, methodical, clear thinking. He'd simply decided that his definition of justice mattered more than society's. That's more frightening than insanity because it's harder to predict, harder to prevent. How many other people are out there with property they value more than human life just waiting for someone to cross the line? The victims' families received modest settlements from Russell's estate and from the sale of the farm. The amounts were insufficient, insulting even, measured against the loss of husbands, fathers, sons. Patricia Mitchell used her settlement to create a scholarship fund in her husband's name. Ellen Garrett used hers to establish a memorial for her husband and son in Dodge City, the only physical memorial to the 12 victims that exists anywhere. The question that the trial never adequately answered still lingers. At what point does protecting property become murder? Where is the line between reasonable force and execution? What do we owe to property rights versus human life? Russell Whitaker had his answer. His property, his boundaries, his legacy mattered more than 12 lives. That answer cost him everything, destroyed the very thing he was trying to protect, ensured that the Whitaker name would be associated forever with horror rather than with honest farming.